Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. And welcome to this session on how a disruptor can be a supporter as part of Urbanism Next Europe, this very first edition of the European version of an already existing conference in the US. So before we get started, let me share some housekeeping rules with all of you. I'm asking my colleague Niklas, thank you, to change the housekeeping slide indeed. So you can write your comments in the chat if you have any. You can also look at which other people are attending the session in the People tab. And if you have any questions, and we definitely encourage you to ask questions, you can post them under the Q&A tab. For those who would like to have a bigger screen, they can hide the chat or tap on the full screen icon to see everything on full screen. And just for your information as well, this meeting is being recorded, and recordings will also be made available after the session or after the conference. For those of you who have speaking rights, we kindly ask you to keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. And when speaking, be brief and to the point, but I have no doubt that this will be the case. So let me show you on the next slide which great speakers and panelists we have lined up for you in this disruption and supporting session, let's say. That's Lidia, Signor, Manager Combined Mobility of UITP, the International Transport Association. Terry Travis, Managing Partner at EVNoire. Saul Lopez, Manager E-Mobility of Transport and Environment. Garance Lefèvre, Director of Public Policy of Lime in France and the Benelux, and Chris Pangilinan from Uber, where he is Head of Global Policy and Public Transportation and Accessibility. So I'll be telling you a bit more of each of these people when they give their introductory presentation, but I'll first like to set the scene myself with a couple of introductory slides in terms of how POLIS is looking at innovation versus disruption. And let me try to share my screen. I hope you can all see my screen now. So how can a disruptor be a supporter as well? Or can a disruptor be a supporter in the first place? That's the question that we are also dealing with within the context of the POLIS network, a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and innovation. And we see that urban mobility policies are very much shaped around the main challenges and policy goals that we encounter in our cities when it comes to transport. And that is the need for decarbonization, the need to improve air quality, the need for a modal shift away from the private car and behavioral change for that matter, and the need to make our roads safer, especially for vulnerable road users. These challenges and policy goals are very much shaping today's sustainable urban mobility policies in cities. At the same time, there are also a lot of expectations and needs that are being put onto the urban mobility ecosystem, which we want to be intermodal, multimodal, affordable, user-centric, connected, inclusive, seamless, and many more things. If we want an urban mobility ecosystem that ticks all those boxes, we really need a systems approach and a mix of measures that ideally bring multiple benefits. At the heart of such an ecosystem should be a modal shift away from the private car, with public transport and active travel as a backbone. At the same time, we see that over the last couple of years, the lines between the public and private sector have been blurring, in the sense that what used to be the preserve of the public sector in terms of mobility service provision is also increasingly being taken up by the private sector. And this is kind of leading to an identity crisis, I would say, almost from the side of the public sector, and begs the question what the role of the local authorities should be in the transport system of tomorrow. What we very strongly believe in at POLIS is that there is a strong role to play for the public sector, in fact, when we talk about disruption and innovation. And we see that many disruptions and innovations have been coming our way in cities over the last couple of years, all at a very fast pace and all at the same time, whether we're talking about digitalization, automation, urban air mobility, micromobility, electrification, or more. And we believe that cities can't just be reactive, but that they have to be proactive and have to be strategic when looking at these innovations and disruptions, because depending on how they will respond to them, they might or might not be delivering on the always great promises that they bring along. but maybe will not always be able to realize. And what we also tell our cities that FOMO is never a good reason for engaging in a certain innovation. We first have to see whether that innovation is actually a solution to a certain problem we would like to solve in our cities, or a certain service that we would like to offer. And for many of the disruptions and innovations you see on this slide, this is actually the case. Automation could lead to more urban sprawl, or it could help release urban space. Mobility as a service could favor intermodality and multimodality and more sustainable mobility, but also could be prioritizing the wrong modes if we don't regulate it. And micromobility as well could come with negative externalities if we don't set certain rules. So basically, what we think is that we need regulatory frameworks that maximize opportunities, but also mitigate negative externalities when it comes to new solutions that enter our city streets. And that will unavoidably require a combination of carrots and sticks. So we do believe in strong public sector oversight and in regulation to foster innovation. So that's basically to set the scene for this session, where we will have different perspectives in the panel discussions, both from the public and the private sector, or a combination of the two, and how we can really maximize the potential brought by private sector players as well in terms of serving public policy goals. So without any further ado, I will now turn to who is really important in this session, and that's the different panelists, of course. And each of them will be giving us an introductory presentation where they will be reflecting on how they position themselves in the transport landscape of today, and also whether they consider themselves rather a disruptor or a supporter of the urban mobility ecosystem, but also what their priorities are in this public-private partnership environment that we are currently in. So I would like to invite, as a first speaker, Lidia Signor to the stage. She is Manager Combined Mobility at UITP within the governance unit, and she holds a master's degree in urban mobility planning and design. After a specialization in international cooperation in developing countries and several professional experiences in France, Peru, and Morocco, and before joining UITP, Lidia was also involved in the MAS Alliance, which I'm sure is known to many of you, looking into mobility as a service and bringing the different stakeholders in that ecosystem together. So Lidia, I invite you to join me on stage, and then we'll be happy to hear your opening statement.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for the introduction, not just mine, but also the position of POLIS. I won't say very different things, so that's good. Since representing more public transport, I think we see similar points. But let me just go with a few sets of points that I prepared. Also to set a bit looking forward to the panel today. So as said, I'm the manager for combined mobility at UITP, and we have the luck, actually, the chance to be discussing with members from all over the world. It's very much international on topics, and more particularly in the case of combined mobility. We're talking about multimodal strategies, how we can complement public transport, how we can enhance it, how we can integrate one with the other. We're looking at very much the mobility landscape. So I'm happy to have different members from authorities or public transport operator, and of course, all different providers of mobility services. So it's a very enriching experience. And that has been very enriching as well during this year of the pandemic. So looking at this, what we all share as an horizon is very much what was also highlighted by Karen, which is somehow shifting towards a more sustainable portfolio of mobility. If you look it into with the frame of lifestyle, so it's looking into this shift, but it's also looking at different needs of people and therefore different services. So I think this is something that we need to stress very much. But let me perhaps bring you a more wider perspective on the challenges that the sector is facing according to what we've been working at UITP in general. I would say that we of course agree that economic recovery and resilience of the transport system is something very, very important and somehow urgent and tragic somewhere. If you think about the fact that public transport has been running all the time the last year to, of course, provide important service to essential workers. Not everybody was teleworking, of course, but that has a cost, and that now we're trying to see how we can support public transport to continue to run and actually be the backbone for all the rest of the mobility ecosystem there. So that's a very key important point. And in there, I can see that we start to see the multimodal strategy can support public transport. So this is very good news and will tell us that, yes, we need to support together this multimodal strategy and combined mobility. Another point is very much quality of life. And again, what I was stressing before, the fact that we saw perhaps better this year that we have different needs in terms of mobility and different habits, and those can also change. So that's also a key point, key challenge, how we can steer the behavioral change somehow for a better mobility, a better quality of life. And then, of course, decarbonization is, everybody's talking about it, but now we really have to accelerate on this. We have, of course, an energy transition to do, but very much my stress will be on modal shift, but also on reducing perhaps the need of moving, because we need to perhaps move from the focus on mobility to focus on accessibility of opportunities, what transport means for people, reaching out to opportunities. And perhaps they don't need to right now. Well, now I'm in the office for the first time, but I've been working from home, so I didn't need to move. Perhaps there are all the solutions outside of transport that can help us reach the decarbonization of the sector. So with this initial thoughts, that opens up to the opportunity very much to partner with all the different stakeholders there, to learn together one from the other, and to really shape this set of policy that can bring you there. I'd like to leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Lidia, and we'll surely be coming back to several of the points that you made in the discussion round afterwards. So happy to welcome then our next speaker to the stage, which is Terry Travis. He's managing partner at EVNoire. And EVNoire is working with companies, transit agencies, utilities, nonprofits, government agencies, public health groups, regional and national EV organizations, developers, as well as also manufacturers on all facets of e-mobility. So they approach their work also from a social justice lens that provides creative solutions as well as equitable outcomes, which is very important, of course, especially also when we talk about electric vehicles. Their areas of expertise are multimodal, electric, connected, autonomous, and shared vehicles. So Terry, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts, your opening statement on the disruption versus support discussion. The floor is yours.
Good morning or good day, everyone. I'm glad to be here, Karen. Thank you for the introduction. I think that the very presence of our organizations is very disruptive. We are looking at a system that basically has been, particularly in the US, has been very homogenous. And so for the ecosystem to really grow and for us to expand the tent beyond where we currently are and begin to look at multimodal EV adoption, it's critically important that all facets of communities are engaged in these conversations. I am going to share a screen really quickly here. And yeah, cool. Just give a really quick synopsis of what we do. So the short story of it is that, the work that we do is focused around e-mobility best practice. So 50% of the work that we do is around helping fleets and others in the ecosystem begin to understand how they can transition into a cleaner and greener future. And for us, that's really multimodal. So looking at everything from e-bikes and scooters all the way up to medium heavy duty mass transit, school bus electrification as well. The other side of what we do is e-mobility, diversity, equity, inclusion, to ensure that for us, it's really not just about ensuring that we progress in a way that we, have in the past, but how do we begin to make mobility something that benefits all segments of communities, and how do we begin to look at mobility through the lens that, over the past year under the pandemic, we've seen how essential critically essential communities have been to the country and to the world, and having access to mobility, whether that be light duty passenger vehicles, or whether that be first and last mile, whether that be medium and heavy duty, like there's some critical importance that happens there, and how do we begin to shape that future? With that being said, if we think about this through the lens of what's happening in the US and then Europe, the average consumer commutes 25 to 35 miles in the US and hasn't really thought about electrification. We do a lot of research, data analysis, and monitoring. And what we find is that the average consumer or commuter just hasn't really thought about that. Working in some more international markets as well, we've seen that this is something that, there are some really good case scenarios for transportation electrification. And we really have to zero in and really prioritize those communities. One of the things that our data points show is that even with 17 billion being spent just in the US alone on automotive advertising, there's a huge gap in knowledge. When we ask folks to name electric vehicles, they often name a manufacturer that doesn't manufacture electric vehicles. And so it's just very startling to see where those gaps are. Some of the services that we provide are really looking at where infrastructure should be deployed, fleets, as I mentioned earlier, public policy work to ensure that public policy is beneficial for all communities. Our co-founder is a former medical school professor who's actually published quite a bit on the social determinants of health. So when we think about disruption, when folks have thought about mobility traditionally, it hasn't necessarily been approached from that public health lens. And so now what we're beginning to see, based on publications by WHO and some of the others, that folks are beginning to think through this different lens, because we're experiencing a public health crisis, particularly in those communities that have been overburdened in this space and underrepresented. We also are the producers nationally of the National Mobility Equity Conference, where we take a dive into this, and this will be coming up in November of this year as well. In addition, we are also the co-founders of the nation's largest network of diversity drivers and enthusiasts, with members and chapters not just in North America, but actually in the Caribbean, Central America, Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. Europe being a critical source for us, because we have a number of EV drivers who their experiences are different than their counterparts, and going and being able to examine and dive into what's going to make transportation electrification or mobility beneficial for them is going to be critically important as we begin to move things forward. Here is, wanted to quickly share some of the folks that we work with and members of our team, literally stationed all across country, and we have some folks who are a part of our team internationally as well. But I think that I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I think that there's so much intersectionality as we begin to think through this. How are we going to connect, mobility in its true sense? So how are we going to be, as was said earlier, connecting mass transit in certain situations? How are we going to be able to address rural communities and what they're facing? How are we going to be able to connect and really help those folks who are living in urban cores, who are overburdened and literally not benefiting from the current transportation system? So really looking forward to the conversation today, and can't wait.
Thanks a lot, Terry, for setting the scene from your perspective. And we'll be moving on then to Saul, who is Manager E-Mobility at Transport and Environment. He joined TNE in 2019, and he brought along a passion for e-mobility and 15 years of experience in supply chains and transport. He leads campaigns to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles with a focus on corporate fleets, sustainable batteries, and charging infrastructure. And TNE, Transport and Environment, is Europe's leading clean transport campaign group. And their vision is a zero-emission mobility system that is affordable and has minimal impacts on our health, climate, and environment. They have been around for 30 years already and have really shaped some of Europe's most important environmental laws as well. Saul, the floor is yours.
Hello, Karen, and hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak and for having me here. Like Karen outlined in the introduction, TNE's vision is a zero-emission mobility system that's affordable and has minimal impacts on our health, our climate, and the environment. So what this means in practical terms is we need to walk more, cycle more, use public transport more, multimodal solutions, shared mobility, and only when no appropriate alternatives are available, then the use of private vehicles comes in. And of course, all these vehicles, be it two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, private, shared, whatever, they all need to be zero emissions. So in order to achieve that, we have a specific work program focusing on urban fleets and also corporate fleets. We also have one focusing on clean cities, and TNE therefore positions themselves as in the disruptor supporter scale. We're clearly a supporter of zero emission transport. Currently, our top priority at TNE is to phase out the sales of vehicles with an internal combustion engine in Europe by 2035 at the latest. Why is that? Well, mainly because cars and vans are responsible for 15% of all Europe's carbon dioxide emissions, and they are the single largest source of toxic nitrogen oxide emissions. So these emissions, these toxic nitrogen oxide emissions, cause chronic diseases and the premature deaths of over 50,000 Europeans every year. And then on top of that, oil costs the European economy over 200 billion every year in imports. So with this goal in mind, the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles, TNE has also additional work streams in place to boost the uptake of zero-emission vehicles in the European Union. A particularly important work stream for the topics that we are discussing here today is that of corporate and urban fleets. And why do we have such a work stream in place? Why do we focus on urban fleets and corporate fleets? Well, because company cars or corporate cars drive on average 2.25 times further than private cars. The numbers go like this. A private vehicle will drive on average in Europe 12,000 kilometers per year, but a corporate car will drive 37,000 kilometers per year on average. And when you look at urban fleets, high mileage urban fleets like taxi fleets and ride-hailing fleets, it's even worse. They drive 5 times more. They drive 60,000 kilometers per year on average. So electrification of this segment is a low-hanging fruit for governments and the EU alike to make progress towards decarbonizing transport. Corporate and urban fleets with millions of polluting vehicles can be targeted easily with only a few measures and can reap huge climate benefits. And then there's another point that's also important. It's crucial for the wider transition to electric cars. And that is, if we electrify corporate vehicles today, those vehicles will be entering the used car market very quickly. The average ownership for corporate vehicles is 36 to 48 months. So if we electrify those, a continuous influx of relatively new and cheap zero-emission vehicles will be available to private buyers on the second-hand car markets. And that's when a huge shift is expected in the overall car park in Europe, because the average European buys used cars. So accelerating electrification of corporate and urban fleets today means much faster and affordable penetration of zero-emission cars into the wider European car stock. So what can policy and decision makers at city level, but also member state level and EU level do well, they can set the appropriate policy measures to accelerate the electrification of these fleets, of corporate and urban fleets. For example, at EU or at member state level, policies that require corporate and urban fleets to go zero emissions must be rolled out with a mandate for any company with a large fleet size, for example, 25 or 50 vehicles or more, to purchase already 50% of its fleet as zero emissions by 2025 and 100% by 2030. Fleets must electrify first, ahead of private vehicles. So another thing that can be done is have a wide revision of key legislation for charging infrastructure, because this will accelerate the rollout of the badly needed charging infrastructure. This can be achieved through, for example, it's about to come out in July, a rapid revision of the European charging coverage via the Charging Infrastructure Law, the AFID, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. So we need this quick upgrade of the charging infrastructure. We need more public charging for all vehicle segments. And this has to be combined with the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive revision, so that sufficient and future-proof workplace and also home charging infrastructure in buildings is deployed across Europe. And then for urban fleets, for ride-hailing and taxis, a particular focus on slow, overnight, on-street charging, especially in suburbs and neighborhoods where taxi and ride-hailing drivers live, is also needed, together with the deployment of city fast charging hubs dedicated to these urban fleets. So last but not least, and this is also very important for today's discussions, local policies at city level can bring also a lot of power. It's a powerful tool to boost the uptake of zero-emission vehicles in the high-mileage urban fleets. Zero-emission zones must be rolled out and improved and expanded so we can ban progressively more and more polluting internal combustion engine vehicles from the most populated areas from the cities. So that's it for me for now. I'm looking forward to having very nice conversations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul, for providing us with a comprehensive overview of what can be done and should be done to indeed boost the electric vehicle rollout, and also showing that this will require indeed a combination of incentives, but also disincentives for dirty vehicles, let's say. So we're moving on to our next speaker and panelist, which is Garance Lefèvre. She's Director of Public Policy, France and Benelux at Lime. And she works hand in hand with cities to help develop shared, lightweight and carbon-free mobility solutions as a useful complement to existing urban transportation offers. Prior to joining Lime, Garance spent 3 years at Uber, where she was managing government relations in France before moving to its micromobility branch, the Jump unit, basically. Garance is Franco-British. She's living in Amsterdam right now, and she's dreaming of seeing complete streets become a widespread reality. Tell us a bit more about your dreams, Garance.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction and for the invitation. I have prepared a few slides, so I will share my screen with you. There we go. This presents. So yes, I think that most of us would agree that Lime and especially shared e-scooters embody the concept of disruption in the sense that they seem to have developed very quickly, almost overnight, and in non-existent frameworks. They've been non-existent not only in regulatory framework, but also physically in cities, do not seem to have any dedicated space, which has created some negative externalities, as we have seen in many places. And when Lime launched back in 2017, I think that a lot of us could have also believed that maybe were just a craze or reminiscent of the first wave of shared bikes that almost disappeared as quickly as they had appeared because they had failed to find economic viability. However, 3 years and one global pandemic later, shared micromobility is still here and seems here to stay. And you can see here the footprint of Lime globally. We operate daily 150,000 vehicles. We have reached over 230 million trips worldwide and are present in more than 30 countries. And in fact, cities such as London, New York City, Paris have carefully designed programs to allow micromobility to develop and respond to their mobility policies. And we see today that it seems to be a full dimension of the transport offer of a city and of the city's policy. And Lime is actually no longer just an e-scooter company. Today, we are a multimodal platform, and we offer, on top of e-scooters, shared e-bikes and shared e-mopeds as well, that all cover trips of different lengths, but that can all serve to cover trips below 10 kilometers in cities, which are the vast majority of urban trips, as you know. And I think that the reasons why the shared micromobility is today so much present and relevant, I think there are three reasons for that. First, because they are popular modes, they have found their audience and use among riders, because the hardware itself, the vehicles, has improved, especially becoming more robust and safe. You can see here on the right the fourth generation of our scooter, who is the safest ever built, and we launched it 3 weeks ago in Stockholm, and we haven't had any repairs to do on it yet, which is a very encouraging sign. And safety is important because it actually drives usage. If you feel safe riding an e-scooter, then you will use it more, and it also opens up to different categories of population and become a more inclusive mode of transport. I think the second reason why shared micromobility has become so widespread is also because it actually supports cities' goals to foster green ways to move around, to decrease the use of the private car. And I think the third reason is because from being a disruptor, shared micromobility companies like Lime have become clear supporters of city policy goals, and that actually the industry has grown and developed hand in hand with cities and regulators, and that we have innovated in a way that helps address the negative externalities that these modes could have created, but also go beyond and really help foster the modal shift in cities and the shift in the allocation of the public space to decrease the place of polluting modes in favor of lighter modes and creating people-first cities. So basically giving back the space to the citizens. And at Lime, we believe that we have two customers, so the end rider, of course, but also the city. And when we talk about people-first cities, what we mean is that we addressed 4 axes to make this a reality. First, the sharing of the public space in a respectful way. Second, ensure consistency on an environmental point of view between our vision to promote durable mobility, but also the logistics behind that have to be responsible from an environmental point of view as well. Third, equity and inclusion. It would not make sense for us nor for our host cities if our offer were only for privileged urban dwellers that are often the ones who already have access to a lot of transport offerings already. And fourth, how do we integrate with the existing offer, so the backbone of transportation, as Lidia and Karen mentioned, which is public transport, because our offer needs to make sense and to feed in this existing network of transportation for it to be fully relevant to especially to the people who live a bit further away from transit hubs. So first, on sharing respectfully the public space, I think what I would like to illustrate here is the fact that we really leverage our tech to build features that have a concrete impact on the public space, and that we can adapt to the specificities of every city and the rules that cities want to put in place. You have here an example of what we do in the city of Paris, for example, where dedicated parking spots have been built especially for e-scooters and for e-bikes. We are then capable of asking our riders through the app to make sure that they park where they should park and ask them to take a picture so that we can check that they have parked correctly. And then because for this to work, you need as a city to have a very broad, dense network of parking spots, we collaborate with cities to share the relevant data on usage so that they can know where to implement the parking spots for these shared modes. On sustainable operations, as I was saying, it is really important that we support cities' goals of decreasing pollution and improving air quality. And it wouldn't make sense if we were using thermal vans. And this is why we strive to use e-cargo bikes to swap batteries on our vehicles directly. So our vehicles, as you can see on the left, they have swappable batteries, and the next generation of our vehicles will have actually the same batteries between the bike and the scooters, which will further decrease the impact in terms of logistics travel. And third, on inclusion and accessibility to the greater number. There are different angles in which Lime addresses these points. First, in our workforce, we make sure to integrate and to hire locally the people who would work for us, because it's a very strong value at Lime that we want to empower the people who work with us and want to have a diverse workforce. Then it's also working with the relevant community actors so that we, again, make sure that we do not only offer a mode to a certain category of population, but that we take into consideration also the non-users of our services. And you see a picture here in the center of a collaboration that we do with an association for blind citizens, so that our teams know and are conscious about the risks of scooters on the public way, on the pavements. And then to the right, this is an illustration of the Lime Able program, which we have launched a few months ago in the United States, where we have adapted our hardware to people with disabilities. And fourth, how do we integrate and how do we make sure that our offer helps cover first and last mile trips to feed into the public transit existing network? So this takes different forms. First, it's integrating with services such as City Mapper, which aggregate different offers and will then indicate which is the most relevant combination of modes that you need to make according to your time, your budget, and if you want to decrease the carbon impact of your trip. Then you have an example here in the middle of an integration with the Norwegian Entur application. So this is a typical journey planning integration that we are capable of doing with mass applications. And the third way of collaborating with public transit is depicted on the right here. It was during the strikes of the public transit operator in Paris, where you can see the people waiting for the bus that was not arriving behind, and we actually partnered with the RATP, so the operator, to provide additional deployment of Lime scooters and promotional offers for using these shared modes during the strikes. Finally, I wanted to touch upon this campaign that we launched in this end of, hopefully the end of the pandemic, and in the wake of the green recovery that we expect in our cities. This is our People First campaign, and the aim of this campaign is to be supporters of what our cities have developed in terms of nice cycling infrastructure. So you have here an example of a picture in Paris where we basically applaud what the city has done, and then we communicate this through our different channels to our riders across the world and empower our riders to also advocate in favor of these policy developments and cheer for the city's achievements. So this was it from Lime, and I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well.
Thank you, Garance, for providing us with an overview of how you cooperate with cities. We can come back to some of the negative externalities as well as opportunities related to micromobility in the discussion afterwards, indeed. And now we'll move on to our last speaker, Chris Pangilinan from Uber. And Uber is also actually the initiator of this session. And Chris is head of global policy for public transportation and accessibility at Uber. In this role, Chris works to help public transportation agencies and riders harness Uber's technology platform to make transit more convenient and easier to use. His work also includes improving accessibility for people with disabilities to the Uber platform. And prior to joining Uber, Chris served in various roles in transit research and advocacy, local public transportation agencies, and the US federal government. So a very diverse background, which I think gives you a very good outlook on both the public and the private side of the story. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone who just spoke. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the work we're doing and how it fits into this theme here of how a disruptor can become a supporter. Just as brief, we view our, at Uber, working in public transportation, we view our work in the transport landscape, taking on two roles here. One is connecting riders to public transport, and two is also working on the other side and empowering public transport authorities to serve their riders better. And directly connecting to riders involves both connecting them directly through journey planning and mobile ticketing and multimodal journeys, so they can take different modes, but together to get to where they need to go. But also indirectly, such as supporting a car-free lifestyle or car-light lifestyle. That way, riders are able to have their range of trips served mostly by public transport, but as they need be, a car, a pool ride, whatever it might be, to act as a sort of mobility insurance when public transport might not be the best option or available at the time of their travel. And on the second point about empowering public transport authorities, this is where we see our role helping transport authorities expand into this bigger role of mobility manager. And in this role, we're able to empower public transport authorities to tap into a transportation network company's network for on-demand transit, first, last mile, or using their own operators and their own drivers to use the software as a service and be able to serve their communities much more effectively, perhaps communities that might have been underserved by transit before due to its difficult reach with this new mode of public transportation. And being able to combine all these together in a software as a service, transportation network company, and mobility as a service can empower these public transport authorities to expand their services beyond what they traditionally do, which is great, but being able to use the new technologies out there to be even better for their riders. So on the scale of disruptor or supporter, I think it's pretty clear that Uber has played both. I think a lot of people know Uber as a disruptor in this space, but also getting into the supporter role is also key. Being able to create or popularize, if not create, the idea of on-demand transportation was a pretty big disruptor role in the way that things were before. But I think that it's important for us, and I think we're doing this now, to transition into this role of supporter and to help bring the technology and the benefits that we've been able to develop with our platform to the public sector and allow the public sector to harness this technology so that we can continue to raise the bar and be that disruptor, but also be that supporter in helping others raise the bar with us and not be alone in reaping the benefits of raising that bar. And the important reason is because that when public transportation in general is thriving, it means that cities are thriving. And when both are thriving, it means that we're all thriving together. We can't have one without the other. And so it's important for us, it's important for public transport to be rising and supporting our cities together. So moving on to the last point here about current priorities in this space here, what we want to be doing is creating a platform that meets the needs of people who travel. So that when you open up the Uber app, you're able to see a bunch of different ways to get around your cities and different communities. If you need deliveries, or if you're earning on the platform, to be able to have those opportunities to earn and make money and support your activities. And really what that means to do that is it means we need to give riders choices on the platform. It can't just be taking a car ride. And we've seen us move toward that direction. I think this is going to be important for all private entities to be able to recognize that public transport and the public realm is a big part and a backbone of transportation in urban areas. And so incorporating and empowering those public transport options is going to be key for the platform, again, to meet that goal of being the platform that people turn to when they need to get around or they need a delivery. And we also want to be, towards that end, empowering public transport authorities to make that choice to take transit easy and convenient, to make public transport the mode of choice, which means, of course, the fixed route systems being up and running and funded and all that, which is great, but also being able to support them in those other areas outside of the fixed route realm. And of course, playing our role of that enabling a car-free, car-light lifestyle where someone doesn't have to own a private car or doesn't have to own 2 private cars, and we can complement their rides on public transportation as necessary. So I think it's going to be, just to sum it up here, playing that role of disruptor, but bringing those disruption benefits to the public sector will be key, and working with the public sector in order to create the right framework so that both sides, if you will, are able to benefit from this technology revolution and innovation in transportation. So I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Chris, and good to hear how Uber has also repositioned itself from being just a disruptor in the early days to a supporter also of the sustainable urban mobility goals that we have in our cities today. I would like to invite all speakers to come onto the stage so that we can kick off the panel discussion. And while they are arriving to the stage, I'm also inviting the participants to post their questions under the Q&A tab so that we can take your questions into the discussion as well. So I think, yes, we are complete. And I would like to kick off the discussion by going back to Lidia, actually, because you, of course, were mentioning how public transport made sure that services kept running during the pandemic for those who needed them. But of course, we also know how public transport has been suffering tremendously at the same time from this pandemic. So in your membership, you obviously stand for public transport, but you also have Uber as a member. So I'm wondering how you see the interplay between these different kinds of members that you have, and you representing the combined mobility activities of UITP. How can the two worlds come together in a way that they complement each other and also not compete with each other, and that they reinforce public transport and help public transport to recover after this pandemic?
Thank you for the question, Karen. Yeah, we'll start first by stressing the fact that, yes, public transport was the one running during the pandemic, of course, as a public service. So that was very much its role. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of what happened. There was a crisis. It was immediate. We need to take actions immediately and to put in place practices and products to clean everything and train people. It was a huge undertaking that was done by the sector with cost, of course, and wider impacts in terms of financing also, because if you think about in some places parking is funding public transport, and if you have nobody going to the city, or the city is not collecting the fee during the pandemics, then it's also an impact on public transport. Just to put that in the context that the impacts are multiple, but also to say that it was not only public transport trying to help out. Something that we have seen from the wider mobility sector is some players, after, of course, the first shock, and some they just retrieved their vehicles and just stopped the operations at the beginning. But then some of them, they came back and they tried to help out as well. So we also saw that. Just to say that, yes, we are sharing some goals and some values, and we saw that also during the pandemic. Now, what Chris was saying of Uber, that's also something that we have seen at UITP. And of course, myself, I've been working in these topics for the last year and a half at UITP. I started the first week of lockdown, and I'm very happy today to be at the office after 1 year and a half, first day. But it's something that we have seen, and we're still working on it. I think that we need to keep in mind that this is a work in progress. This is not like one or there are a lot of gray areas, and it's something which is very good because it means that we can shape it. So with that in mind, I like to stress perhaps the fact that to shape it, we need to know, first of all, where we want to go somehow, and we need to have something to test that we are getting there. So we need to have evaluation. We need to share information on the impact, which is complicated because it's complicated is the mobility system. But nevertheless, I really think that something that cities should improve or should learn is very much the skills to deal with novelties, innovations, set up a frame of learning from themselves, setting KPIs and checking them regularly. To do that, they cannot do it alone. They need, of course, the help of partners. They need to work together, create trust, but also to be able to check from time to time and adjust. So I think that this learning frame is very much what we need to put in place more mainstream.
And adopt some of the agility that we see in the private sector also onto the public sector, even though I think this pandemic has proven that also the public sector can be agile and can act fast when needed. So hopefully we can capitalize on that for the future as well. Chris, coming back to you, how have you experienced the past year? So you say you're investing indeed in forging partnerships with the public sector, but you have suffered as well, I can imagine, throughout the pandemic. And how has this impacted your business or has changed certain priorities?
Yeah, definitely the pandemic has been, for anybody in touching transportation, we've seen ridership drop off significantly after March and April of last year. But thankfully for riders and for us and for earners, it has been rebounding steadily. And we do have I think now kind of the floodgates opening up as people are trying to get back out again, as thankfully the vaccines are out there and people are getting less sick, which is great. But, it has opened up, just one example is, the idea of shared rides had to be reduced because of COVID, but that will be coming back as it gets safer again to share vehicles. So that was a big impact, of course. Another impact is just the idea of what does it mean to commute and to go to work. And I think this is something that not just us, but also public transport authorities have been facing, where we had such a huge emphasis on the central business district before COVID, whether you're going to the financial district or whatever it might be of your city. And I think what happened is during the last 2020, during the year of 2020, we saw that is actually, although it is an important part of our economy, of course, a lot of workers ended up working from home and exposed kind of the services that we were not providing, we as in the transport industry at large, that we all fit into here, we're not providing services to those jobs that we deemed essential, right? And they might not be downtown, they might be at midnight or 4 a.m. shifts at a hospital, whatever it might be. And so I think coming out of this, it's my hope that we look at, collectively as cities, as states, what are our priorities in serving transportation in the future, and what is the best way to do so? And I think for us, that's kind of influenced the way that we've looked at our work. We acquired Route Match in June, which is a public transportation software company, and looking at ways that we can empower public transportation authorities to serve their communities, whether they be central business districts or otherwise, in the best way possible, and being able to empower those essential trip services going forward as we recover from the lockdowns and COVID.
As we gradually and finally seem to be moving out, crossing fingers, out of this pandemic, there will be, besides the health crisis, we have faced an economic crisis as well that we have to deal with. And I think, Garance, it's not any different for the micromobility business, that on the one hand you have suffered, but also, as Lidia said, you stepped into the front lines as well at some point. But so this economic dimension will be even more important, I would say, than before when we look at mobility as well. So I was wondering if you have any indications on what generally, beyond the pandemic, but more in general economic terms, the impact is of micromobility on local business and local economy. Do you have any information on that?
Yes, and indeed, the pandemic, of course, had consequences on our ridership and the curfews, of course, as well. And at the same time, we did strive to maintain a minimum service for the people who needed to commute. And we also made sure that coming out of this pandemic, because micromobility is an open air, physically distant mode of transport, it has a key role to play. And indeed, the impact on local economy of micromobility is tangible, and I think it also contributes to what makes people first cities and cities that are nice places to live in, because when you travel by bike or by scooter, you are more prone to make opportunistic stops to shops and to consume in your local neighborhood. And what we that 35% of riders use Lime to visit a business at least once a week. So these are global figures. And that 21% of trips were for shopping or running errands specifically. So I think it gives a good idea that on top of commuting or leisure rides, actually scooter rides, shared bike rides also have a role to play in dynamizing the attractiveness of city center businesses, which have suffered a lot during COVID.
Yes, it's not a topic of this panel, but of course the impact of e-commerce and how it has been booming has a very strong impact also on local business and retail. And generally, we also see that active travel has a positive impact on local commerce, that pedestrianization and moving cars away from the city center is not negative. On the contrary, for local business. So glad to hear that also micromobility can contribute to that. Now, I would like to focus a bit on the electrification side of the story now, combined with the aspect of equity and inclusion, which is at the heart of your work, Terry. I think we can also say that this health crisis has shown that those who were already vulnerable before the pandemic became even more vulnerable during the pandemic. That's one aspect, and I would like to have your take on it. How, besides this very sad conclusion, whether you maybe also see opportunities for becoming more inclusive and having a more equitable system. But also the other aspect I would like to touch upon is that very often when we talk about electrification, that it's mentioned that this is only for the rich people, the people who can afford an electric car, and that those who cannot will again be the victim of zero emission zones, for example. So how do you combine electrification with equity, and how do you capitalize, hopefully in one way or another, on the experience of the past year?
Yeah, so I'll start by just recapping. The past year was just a teachable moment for us. It really drove home the importance of the work that we do in ensuring that all facets of communities have access to mobility. What we found is that the nature of our work, we knew that there were communities that were overburdened, underrepresented, and ironically, with no surprise to us, those were the very communities that were impacted first and worst by the negative impacts and higher mortality rates as a result of COVID-19. So it really shows that we have to really begin to accelerate this work, because while the transition for specific communities can be very slow and gradual, for other communities it's literally a matter of life and death. There are communities around the world who are just absolutely overburdened, and it's a public health crisis. to that point, I think that the other aspect that we really zero in on, working with partners at every different level is the fact that there's a triple bottom line opportunity. There's an opportunity to address transportation burden. We see that there are a number of communities that have transportation burden or limited mobility. There is an opportunity to address that public health lens in which we discussed. And then there's a workforce and economic development opportunity that comes along with that. If we are going to have a future that is cleaner and greener with electric, connected, shared, and autonomous vehicles, somebody's going to have to actually deploy that infrastructure and maintain it. So why should it not be those communities that have been bearing the burden of the negative impacts? And so part of the work that we've been doing is really trying to accelerate the opportunities for those communities as we move forward in this conversation. We just think that it's critical to begin to think through it through that lens, and ensuring that not just folks in those communities which you described, the traditional EV driver is the only one benefiting from this. Because right now we like to use a term called privileged mobility. In many parts of the world, we're experiencing this era where if you have access to finance and capital, you have access to cleaner and greener and the best mobility options. And we think that it's critically important to address that through its multimodal sense.
Thank you, Terry. Let's move on to Saul. Of course, you within TNE are working a lot on electrification as well. And as a civil society organization, you're kicking the butts of both the public and the private sector and making sure that they do better. So continuing on this aspect of affordability, so you were mentioning the potential of focusing on those fleets that run a lot of kilometers and also accelerating that way the second-hand market. But so generally the affordability question, are those vehicles finally going to become cheaper as well in the coming years? What does the market tell you?
Yes, they are. They're still more expensive today. The upfront costs are still higher, but already today we see that on a TCO basis, on a total cost of ownership basis, they are cheaper. Although we also know and we assume that not everybody looks at the total cost of ownership perspective, not everybody has an Excel spreadsheet in their minds when they make a purchase decision, so it's not so visible. So we have studies, and the latest we have published together with Bloomberg New Energy Finance shows that by 2027, all segments, vans, passenger vehicles, all of them will be cheaper equipped with an electric vehicle powertrain in comparison with their equivalents with an internal combustion engine. So it is coming. That tipping point is at hand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so coming back to your role as civil society organization, looking at the colleagues around the table, what would be your take in terms of how well or not they are doing when it comes to pushing for electrification? I know you've been working closely with Uber and have been encouraging them, let's say, to do better. What about them? What about the cities? So where do we stand? Is everybody taking the responsibility they should be taking?
Well, you see here what I can tell you is that the best approach is, of course, the collaborative approach, collaborating all the stakeholders together, pushing and trying to advance in the same direction. And over the past few weeks, past few months, we have been organizing a series of workshops, which is something that is part of a broader initiative called the Zero Emission Urban Fleet, which TNE launched with the World Economic Forum and other stakeholders, other organizations, as you know. And as part of these network initiatives, we have conducted workshops at city level, in particular in Lisbon, in Madrid, in Paris, and Berlin. And what we have done with these workshops is that we have called several stakeholders, city representatives, region representatives, representatives of companies, taxi companies, ride-hailing industry, last-mile delivery and transport and logistics companies, charging infrastructure providers. Everybody was at the table, and we asked a series of questions. We said, okay, let's sit down for a minute. Let's discuss what is needed to achieve zero emissions urban fleets. And let's try and identify the challenges and the bottlenecks that exist and what opportunities we have. So by organizing these workshops and these, triggering negotiations, conversations, and discussions at city level, we found out that everybody is very well aligned. Everybody has a clear goal in mind. It's just so, complicated to find out the best way, the best path to follow to move forward. Then many more conversations are needed, of course. But at least what we can see is that we're all together in this. Civil society, public, private sectors. Now all we need to do is find out which specific steps need to be taken now, who does what, and collaborate. But it is reachable. It's at hand. We can do it, and everybody is collaborating to achieve it. So it's good news overall.
That sounds encouraging indeed. Lidia, you represent public transport. I know your main focus is on combined mobility, but can you say something about the electrification of the public transport sector? I mean, Saul was also mentioning the need to focus on fleets. And of course, we can also make a big difference in that respect on the public transport fleets.
Yes, of course, I can say about electrification of the sector, but first of all, I like to stress the importance of a more participation, actually, different stakeholders in this. It's always very refreshing to see. Also, if we cannot meet physically, we try to do it. So that's very valuable, I think. And of course, it's a starting point, but need a process and more discussion on that. On our side, well, of course, UITP is very much engaged in the electrification of the public sector. I'm not talking about tramways or trains because most of them are really electric, right? But it's more about buses. So there's a huge effort on that. There's a lot of projects going on in different parts of the world and also in the second-hand market of buses. So there's a lot of effort that my colleagues are putting on that. It's been a few years now, and it's very much advancing. I don't have numbers to share with you, but it's very much on top of the priorities where UITP is pushing. Now, on my side, what I can see from the combined mobility, or rather the taxi ride hailing, because I also see that sector, is very much that on our side at UITP, we have taxi operators, of course, and we also see this electrification of the sector in that area, and there's a lot to do. And there are big differences from China, for example, where they have cities with 100% of electric taxis, and we are trying to capitalize on their experience and try to see in other cities. But as Saul was saying, context is very different, players are different, so we really need to sit down locally, but nevertheless you can share lessons learned and trigger discussion. That's what I'm trying to see on my small committee around taxi ride hailing. And one thing that I can share clearly, it was that if you don't know that it is possible, you don't even try. But yes, it is possible. There are cities with 100% buses and 100% taxis. So yes, it is possible. And there are ways to get there. So very much, as Saul was saying, positive messages on this from my side.
Thanks, Lidia. We have European as well as American panelists around the table. And I would like to zoom in on the different contexts that we still have in the US versus Europe when it comes, for example, to the strong role of public transport, which I think in Europe is very strong, and in the US maybe less so. Chris, when you position yourself as an enabler of public transport and as a supporter also for transit authorities to offer better services, how do you approach American cities versus European cities? Do you have different priorities? Do you take account of the different ecosystems that you're dealing with?
Certainly do. Even within the US, of course, massive differences between like a New York and San Francisco versus a much more common city, which is smaller, suburban, less population. And so even within these, I think that's a microcosm of how we approach US versus Europe. Like for example, in the United States, New York City, Manhattan, downtown San Francisco, that's always going to be fixed route. There's just no way that would ever be not fixed route in those areas. It's much more efficient and effective. But you'll see smaller communities, maybe like a Livermore, which is outside of California, or Pinellas County, which is outside of Tampa Bay in Florida, where those densities really do lend themselves for an on-demand type of system. And what's interesting too is that even in New York City, there is a Livermore in New York somewhere at some time. On a Saturday or a Friday evening at 4 in the morning, or a Tuesday evening at 4 in the morning. And of course, being New York City, there's lots of people going out and going to work at that time, doing what they need to do. But they might not have the travel density of what normal people we think of in New York. So when we're looking at Europe, it's the same thing too, where a lot of the European core cities are much more dense, more New York representative. Even if they're not as populated or dense, they still have that very strong fabric of fixed route, walkable cities. So what we're looking at there is to see, is there a way that we can, one, help drive people, not literally, but sometimes literally, drive people to public transportation, whether it be through looking at the app for public transportation directions or ticketing, or connecting them to the areas if they live outside that core area to get there. And also enabling where public transport authorities might want to focus on parts of the cities where perhaps there might be, at least in the US concept, the suburbanization of poverty, where people who are forced to live in the further out parts of the city because it's so expensive to live in the center, yet those further out areas are more difficult to serve by transit, and being able to help them target those areas. Yes, there is going to be a difference between US and Europe. Yes, there'll be a difference between small and big. But when we think about it, there really are those small cities, even within big cities, that we need help serving those trips.
Mm-hmm. It's something that we are very much advocating for at POLIS as well, that indeed there are certain situations, certain contexts where it's just more efficient as well and beneficial to deploy shared mobility rather than mass transit. And one of those use cases is indeed suburbia. And when we still at the same time, we see that many of the shared mobility services out there focus on urban cores, where they see the biggest potential business case, I would say. So I would like to turn to Garance and ask you whether, as a micro mobility operator, you're also starting to look at suburban areas, maybe through public-private partnerships that will help you to reach a viable business model, where I think we should also consider possible subsidies, for example, from the public sector. Is this on your radar, or do you continue to focus only on urban cores where actually very often there is also very good public transport in place?
So it is true that for us to make it work from an economic point of view, we need to address dense centers. Let's be honest. I mean, that's where the ridership is the highest, and also the tourism is also the highest. That being said, our approach when we deploy our service in cities is indeed to begin with the core centers, but then we are able to expand. And in the cities we serve today, we serve the entire territory of cities, including those where it wouldn't make economic sense to do so, because we manage to find a balance between the different zones. We also have a specific equity program that is quite rich in the sense that we have a special offer called Line Access for low-income riders, and that they can use if they have no bank account, no smartphone. And in 2020, we reached 500,000 Line Access rides. Those rides are often discounted between 50% and 70%, so it's quite substantial. And an example of an equity program that we have implemented is in Chicago, for instance, where in certain geographic areas of the city, we are able to automatically implement a 50% discount. And so that's an interesting example, because we do see that the ridership is as important in these zones than in the dense urban core. So for us, it makes sense, economically speaking as well, despite the discount. And then as for expanding even beyond and to medium-sized cities and to suburban areas, it is something that we are definitely looking towards, and that we have a hub and spoke vision as well. So when we have a hub with our warehouse, our teams, we are capable also operating further in agile way, because we have this scale effect on the territory. And when it comes to smart subsidies, we are definitely open to study pilots experimentation in this regard. It hasn't been done yet, but we will definitely be open to do so.
I think that would be very interesting indeed to expand that and to see how through public-private sector cooperation we can make this a realistic business case as well. I would like to touch upon a topic now which I want to bring to all of you around the table, and that is mobility as a service. So because we are talking about cooperation between cities and disruptors or supporters, if you will. But we also need, if we want mobility as a service to become a reality, the disruptors or competitors to work with each other and be willing to be integrated in a mass environment, for example, in a way that also ideally, from the city perspective, serves sustainable mobility goals and helps us move towards this multimodality and intermodality range of options, sustainable options that we want to put forward as a valuable alternative to the private car. So I would like to turn to Terry first, and you know, mobility as a service, I could imagine on the one hand could be an enabler to become more equitable and more inclusive, because you offer a wider range of options available to people and a wider range of sustainable options. But on the other hand, I think there might also be a risk that those who are not don't have access to digital services get left out, or that maybe if there is no public governance of mobility as a service, you might end up with premium services where those who pay more get the best service. What is your take on the potential of mass in the overall urban mobility ecosystem and versus inclusivity in particular?
So we've been doing quite a bit of work on mass. We're working with 25 of the largest cities across the country on their transportation electrification roadmaps. A part of that conversation is obviously equitable access. And so when we begin to think about some of the technical issues that come into play, being that if you're going to have mobility as a service, you're still going to need charging infrastructure, connectivity to 5G. You're going to need all of these other things that come into play. And so as we're helping cities navigate through those barriers and challenges, in addition to that, one of the things that I think is critically important to this conversation is how do we be this through an equitable lens? And to your point, we want to ensure that very similarly to the way that charging infrastructure was deployed in its early days, you know, basically what registration or vehicle registrations were, that mobility as a service doesn't follow the same model, that folks at all different levels of socioeconomics, levels, you know, diverse communities are able to access this. And so I think it's the conversations are accelerating. We're going to need some very innovative strategies to ensure this. One of the things that I think is helpful is that we've been collaborating with a number of government agencies, DOT, DOE, EPA, and others, to really think through what this EV infrastructure deployment looks like, how we begin to think through what the different caveats of mobility as a service is going to be. And I think that cities are now beginning, you know, there are some very forward-leaning cities. Obviously, if you begin to look at some of your larger coastal cities, you're seeing a lot of movement there. But now we're seeing these conversations come up in some of the cities that hadn't been talking about this previously. So I think that we'll see an acceleration in some really clear and concise movement coming to ensure that mobility as a service is realized and that it's equitable.
So turning to you, do you think mass could help to accelerate the electrification that we need, in a sense that in addition to the charging infrastructure that needs to be in place, maybe this digital layer could also help facilitating access to that infrastructure once it's there, and also have a more electrified multimodal offer integrated in such a mass ecosystem? What's your take on that?
So digitalization and multimodality are definitely pillars of the mobility of the future. This has perhaps a greater impact on cities and on urban transportation. And we, of course, would like to see that this brings in, again, the overall goal that we have at TNE is that this brings in more zero-emission solutions for transport. So having mobility as a service will, in many ways, mean that there is less usage of private vehicles. So therefore, on top of aiming at having zero-emission transport system, we also should be reducing the amount of private vehicles on the roads. Therefore, mass is a good thing, is something that we definitely welcome, because it will bring a reduction not only on emissions, but also on congestion, therefore noise pollution as well in the cities. It's definitely something that has a great potential, and we support, yes.
Mm-hmm. Good. Chris, what about Uber? So I know that in your transit paper that you recently launched, you also mentioned mobility as a service, where you initially mostly focused on how it can help also to better integrate public transport with Uber-type services. But what about integrating your services also with those of competitors? Do you see yourself evolve to a mass environment where you are one big happy family, not just with the public sector, but also with other private sector players in the field?
Yeah, I think this is going to be interesting next several years as mass evolves, and we start seeing different players get closer to each other. So yeah, like you said, with public transportation, we started to experiment with integrating into public transport apps like in Dallas and other cities, and to understand how we can, how does that help public transportation authorities become that mobility manager, and what does that also do for our riders and the earners on the platform to get more rides. I think when it comes to other platforms, it's going to be a case-by-case basis to see how does that fit well with what our strategy is to be a platform, but also to make sure that the services available on our platform are available through different channels and different ways to get in there. I think the big thing that we want to do, of course, is make sure that for riders, they have a great experience in booking and are able to see and are able to get the best price that is able to be offered. For earners to be able to understand who's getting in their car if it's a car ride, and who's being able to, and who is using the services. And of course, there's all the technical details too, like payment and privacy protection, security, all that stuff that needs to be sorted out. But I think there is going to be a future in that sense where it might not be like this, exactly where anybody can tap into it, because we want to make sure that the system is, has the integrity and the experience we want for riders and drivers, but is able to facilitate at least more than just a single platform, and especially for public transport platforms to be able to link to theirs and make sure they can have that mobility manager role.
Mm-hmm. Lidia, to what extent do you think mobility as a service will be an enabler or will be a disruptor of public transport?
Yeah, good question. I wish I could have a crystal ball to see in the future, but as you say, there are many possible paths, and what we want to do with innovation, of course, is to shape it, right? So that's the vision. So the vision is a mass app, a mass service, or a mass ecosystem system in general. There, as Terry was mentioning, there are so many elements actually that needs to be in place to steer the direction into the one that we want. So in that sense, this is the vision, shape, something that can, of course, sustain, support, put public transport at the center of the mobility system as a backbone, as we all agree. But the point is that to get to mass, there are so many things in place. So we need to act at multiple levels, actually. So it's not just about the digital layers, the payment system, is all the policy that have been put in place. So we continue to that we need to continue and accelerate. It's so many things at once, actually. So it's very much a set of policies, and that's what I usually say is that masses is more of a horizon, actually, that help us to focus towards the same goal and to put together, because it's like in partnership, you really need to shape that vision to create some trust and then to move forward with concrete steps, and those steps are many actually. So we need to very much to put in place all of this. But yes, from our side, should have public transport, walking and cycling, of course, in the center. But indeed, as innovation, paths are open, and we see other trends as well. You see super apps, for example, in Asia, where you have basically their business model is based on the number of users. So they're very much international, and they're very much focusing on commercial opportunities with partners. They bridge, it's not only transport, they bridge all kind of services. And it's not clear what this could bring to public transport or to the mobility landscape so far. So to follow.
Mm-hmm. Let's see what happens indeed. But as you say, we need to shape innovation, and that also is very much aligned with what I was mentioning at the beginning, that from the public sector perspective, it's a matter of aligning policy goals with innovation, and vice versa. So we only have 4 minutes left. So I would like to end with a concluding question to all of you, asking you what is your number one thing on your wish list that would help you move forward in this ecosystem that we're talking about, bringing the public and the private sector together, finding the right balance between support and disruption, between policy goals and private interests. What is your number one thing that you would like to see realized from your perspective in the next period? Let's start with Chris.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. There's a lot here. I will just zero in on having a clear understanding of where we want to go, both on the private side, but also from the public side. And I think that it might be a lot to ask for, but I think it's possible though. I think that we have a lot of great speakers here on this panel and many other panels that we've been to over the last year who have great ideas. And I think that synthesizing, what is it the public sector wants and where does it want to get to, and then being able to feed into that what we are capable of in the private sector to feed that goal. I think that will make these collaborations a lot more constructive and lightning fast, if you will, to get to where we want to go. So that is my number one wish list. So let's all keep working on that.
Great, thanks, Chris. Garance, your wish.
So I was attending the opening session yesterday and found very interesting the comments that today we were basically navigating without knowing, like it's an unpredictable future. And so I'd say that considering this, to make collaboration successful between private and public actors, I think we should both work together on regulation, because actors like us, and I think all of us around the table, welcome regulation because it creates a space for us to innovate and thrive, and that this innovation should be outcome-based, so sustainability, safety, rather than too prescriptive, to let this space for creativity and innovation.
Mm-hmm. But that's indeed an important progress we have made, that also the private sector is calling for that regulation indeed and doesn't see it as something negative. Saul, what's on your wish list?
I was tempted to answer along the same lines, talking about regulation, local regulations that can boost the uptake of zero-emission mobility and in the urban environment. But that can be perceived more as something to be done by the public sector, praised or fought by the private sector, but it's more an action on the public side of things only. So I'll change my answer and I'll choose something that is really more a collaboration between public and private sectors, which is the deployment of charging infrastructure. That really needs to be a joint effort, starting from the design phase, where we decide what type of chargers, what type of power, what type of system, how accessible and available, where, which type of surface land is used to do this, and so on and so forth. This would be a joint effort, a collaborative effort between public and private stakeholders from the beginning, and then goes to construction, the use phase, and so on and so forth. So my answer would then be a public-private collaboration to deploy charging infrastructure as needed for urban fleets to go 100% electric or 100% zero emissions.
Yeah, and overcome that chicken and egg problem indeed. Terry, very quickly, what's your wish?
Yeah, echo all of the things that have been said by my fellow panelists, but I would say understanding the urgency of now. I think that it's critically important that we begin to approach this through the lens that we have to act now. As a global community, if we begin to do things and collaborate and solve problems through that lens, I think we can accelerate the adoption, innovation, all of the other things that will come with it. But we have to really understand the urgency of now in order for all of those other things to be realized. Because if we realize the urgency of now, policy, regulations, all of those things should follow.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because we felt that sense of urgency over the past year, where we really had to act fast. If we can also, transfer that to the other crises, which are maybe less tangible, but actually as urgent, then indeed, let's hope we can all become more agile. Last words for you, Lidia.
It looks like it's important, the last words, but actually everything has been said. So perhaps from my side, I'd like to stress the fact that we might need to reconsider somehow and break the silo, not just public and private, but the mental silo that we have. I would think about the problem and perhaps looking better at people, their needs, and how people work, their behavior, how we want, because we all want to change the habits of people. So by looking more at that, being more knowledgeable in this, including people from other expertise from other sectors to achieve that goal, perhaps will help us surely to get there. The key message was kicking butts, right?
Yeah,
that
we got that.
Right.
Might be locked in. Well,
yeah.
I guess we'll close out while thanking everyone here, and thank you all fellow panelists for speaking. It's been great. Karen, thank you so much for moderating. It was wonderful. And we'll go out there and kick butt, guys.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Let's do kick butt.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good session.
Have a great
Thanks.
rest of your day and stay safe.